Hello, people! Anex here, and it's finally happened. It's taken several months, but I'm finally going to be talking about one of the biggest names in fantasy at the moment, Brandon Sanderson. That's right, it's The Way of Kings, book 1 of 10 of Sanderson's magnum opus, The Stormlight Archive. It's published as 2 books for some reason here, or that's what my library had for some reason. Immediately, if you've seen any of my other videos, you'll notice something's different here. I've swapped out my generic booktuber bookshelf background for a generic white wall and a bed. Not sure if that's an upgrade. But that's because I finally moved back to university and that bookshelf wasn't even mine. I actually only own like 4 or 5 books, and those are on the shelf over there, and I can't really film there because of the window and the light, and you don't care. Also, because I'm in London now, I have access to like 30 libraries, which means I can read physical books again and just look at them. These two combined is The Way of Kings. This is one book. This is going to take you hours to get through, so is it really worth your time? People praise this book a lot, but is it actually any good? Is this really one of the best books in modern fantasy? Let's try to figure that out in this week's 4-point review. If you don't know already, this video is split into 4 categories, which I'm going to use to describe the book in more depth. You can find the timestamps in the description if you want to skip ahead to any of the categories, but why would you want to do that? Also, there are no spoilers in this video. I'm not going to talk about any specific plot points or give details of any specific character arcs because, personally, I don't enjoy being told those in reviews, even if they're not really spoilers. I can make a separate spoiler review if you want my thoughts on all of that stuff. Without further ado, number 1, the world building. This is easily one of the best things about this book. The Way of Kings has one of the best secondary worlds I've ever seen in fantasy. And I think the reason for that is its simplicity layered with its complexity. You're thinking that doesn't make a lot of sense, and you're right. So let me try to explain. Sanderson has designed this entire secondary continent of Roshar on one simple thing which forms the basis for the rest of the stuff. On this continent, every so often, a massive storm blows through, traveling from one side of it to the other. When I say storm, I mean like a Class 57 hurricane. Yeah, it's big. So obviously, this crazy weather phenomenon would have a huge impact on this world. It affects the evolution of the plants and animals on the continent. It affects the cities and the lifestyles of the people living on that continent. It affects their language and their religion and many, many more stuff. All of these are so different to our world. It's really not just medieval Europe with magic. One of my favorite differences is their currency. It uses different gems that each have different values, and these gems are infused with something called Stormlight. It's one of the most unique styles I've ever seen in fantasy. So Sanderson uses the simple concept of a devastating storm and then extrapolates a realistically complex world from it. It's such a simple yet brilliant idea. And man, this world is complex. You spend the majority of your time in just 2 locations, but you do go to a handful of other places too. The amount of descriptions for even those small locations helps us to imagine a fully populated continent. I doubt Sanderson spent 20 years designing every single aspect of Roshar based on the rate that he writes books, but I get the feel that if I point out any single city or valley or named location on that map, he can give me like an hour-long lecture about everything about that place. That is so crucial for building brilliant immersion for the reader. The other thing I love about it is how different it is to our world, whilst still having parallels to some things that we are familiar with. My favorite example of this is the way that society is organized in one of the main cultures that we see on this continent of Roshar, called the Alethi people. Their social hierarchy is based on the lightness of your eyes. The light-eyed people are the ones in charge. They're the rulers and the kings and the lords, and you refer to them as your brightness or bright lord. I thought that was just another bit of really fun and clever world building. The light-eyed noblemen look down on the dark-eyed people who are the peasants of this world. They're seen as inferior because of their eye color. So you see the parallel that I'm talking about, right? But the interesting thing is, not even our morally upstanding, good light-eyed people in the story seem to have a problem with this discrimination. So I think the eye color thing acts as a really interesting way to explore racism on a different world, and I hope it continues to be explored in depth in the later books as well. Number 2, the action. There is much less action in this book than I was expecting. The book is overall kind of mellow, and we'll talk about that later. But the action sequences we do have, though, are epic. You have 2 very different kinds of fights in this book. One of them is really cool because of the magic system. That type of fighting is dynamic and innovative. The possibilities and the limitations of the magic means that you have to think about how you use it. The fights aren't just about us punching as hard as you can. The character that uses that kind of fighting is constantly coming up with really cool techniques, which are still in line with the limitations of the magic that you're told about. So it's really fun to follow along on the action. If I do have one complaint, it's that the introduction of this magic feels a bit like a massive exposition dump. Sanderson tries to integrate it dynamically into the fight, but it's sort of like the character will do something and then there'll be a paragraph explaining how that thing works, and then that repeats throughout the whole scene. It's sort of clunky, but I also understand that it's kind of inevitable when you design that kind of magic. The reader has to be able to understand what's going on. The later scenes where you see that kind of fights are much better. Basically, if you liked the style of action in Mistborn, then you will really love this. Of course, if you're a fan of the less subtle, more thunderous style of action, then Sanderson's got you covered as well. There's a thing in this world called shard plates, which are like suits of armor that gives the wearer insane amounts of endurance and power and energy and stuff. And there's also a thing called a shard blade, which are these epic swords that can cut through anything. Some of our characters fight with these things, which means that you can have some awesome larger than life action sequences. They pretty much become superheroes, mowing down soldiers and entire armies. I found these fights less interesting though compared to the more clever fights I mentioned earlier. I think it's because they're so large and devastating that I found it hard to grasp their true consequences and how it would look in a fight situation. Also, it's an epic fantasy book, and so you have some battles as well. Sanderson puts a lot of focus on the consequences of these battles on the soldiers lower down in ranks, the common soldiers. There's a particular point of view character called Kaladin who gives us a great avenue to explore this. Number 3, the characters. You actually have quite a few point of view characters in this book, but the main 3 I would say are Kaladin Stoneblessed, Dalinar Kholin, and Shallan. I don't know her surname. So I'm going to talk about those 3 for now. I really hope some of the other smaller ones get more pages in the later books, because I think there's a lot to explore with them as well. So as far as I understand, the plan is that in each book, Sanderson is going to explore one of the main characters in depth, and so in this one, that's Kaladin. He's a soldier who ends up as a slave and becomes one of the lowest of the low in the army. I really liked him. Kaladin is possibly one of the most heroic and noble characters ever, and this could have been really annoying and one-dimensional, but he's actually got a lot of layers. Throughout the book, you get short chapters of backstory about who he was and how he became who he is now. His struggles and insecurities are so well designed, and I was really rooting for this brilliant underdog all the way through. Kaladin also has a companion called Syl, who is a wind spren. Spren, by the way, are like manifestations of emotions and nature, so you have anger spren who appear around angry people, and fire spren that appears around fire. Syl is different though for some reason. Their relationship is my favorite one in the whole book. The other big one is called Dalinar Kholin, and he's the exact opposite of Kaladin in terms of social standing. He's a Bright Lord in charge of massive armies, and he's also a Shardbearer, which means he's got a plate and a blade. So he acts as our window to see the other side of society. Like Kaladin, he's also morally upstanding, honorable, and a good person, but he's also got a bit of that Uncle Iroh Dragon of the West thing going on. He's got some dark, violent things in his past, and he's trying to move past them now to be a virtuous person, but it creates some great conflict. The contrast between who he was and who he is trying to be now makes him a great character to follow as well. The third one is Shallan. She's a light eyes as well, but from a smaller house. The other 2 characters I mentioned spend most of their time in this one location called the Shattered Plains, which is a battlefield. That battlefield, by the way, is one of the most unique ones I've ever seen in fantasy. You might notice that I've said the best ever in fantasy quite a lot when I'm talking about this book, and that's because this is one of the most creative and unique fantasy worlds that I've seen in a long, long time. But back to Shallan. She spends her time in the cities and the non-battlefield places in this world. So she's the one that we explore the rest of this really cool world through. I have to say though, she didn't get as much development as the other 2. There's some interesting things hinted about her past, but it's not really explored a lot in this book. Which I guess makes sense because this is Kaladin's book, and so I guess she'll have a book where it's more about her past and backstory. So that's not even really a complaint, is it? She's a really intriguing character, and she's the least sort of honorable and noble character in the book, so she's really the most fun one to follow. If you're a fan of fantasy books filled with morally grey characters, like the First Law series by Joe Abercrombie or the earlier seasons of Game of Thrones, then you won't find many of those in The Way of Kings. The 2 big ones, Kaladin and Dalinar, are both honorable people, almost perfect people to be honest. Shallan is the point of view character who does slightly break that mold. You also have a handful of chapters with some characters who could be counted as grey, but you don't really explore them enough to really understand those characters. But I'm definitely not saying that the really good, honorable characters are badly written or anything. They're just different to what I've been reading for the past few weeks. Number 4, the size. This is a very long book, coming in at over 1,000 pages. Just look at that. And this is only book 1 of 10 of the Stormlight Archive. So this is a long story and it takes a while for things to happen. The book starts out with a bang. Some major events happen in the first few chapters, and then it slows down for a while. You spend a lot of time being introduced to people and places. You get told about the world and the cultures. You're told the history of this world very slowly. You walk around places basically seeing how cool the world building is. The main plot doesn't really kick in for a while, and even when it does, it's not really an Act 1, 2, 3 kind of plot. Basically, I'm trying to say that a lot of this book is just characters existing in this world and doing some stuff. I follow a very simple rule when I start a new story. If I get to about a third of the way through a book and there is nothing in it that I've enjoyed so far, then I just stop reading it. What's the point in spending hours of my time with a story that I'm not having fun with? The thing I enjoy about the book doesn't have to be the plot though, and for this one it wasn't. Like I said, the book takes its time with everything. The plot takes a long time to be revealed, and you could sort of argue that this first book is just set up for the other 9. But the reason I kept reading is the world building. I loved learning about and exploring Roshar so much that I just carried on reading after the first third of the book. Then I slowly started to understand and enjoy the characters too. So I'm trying to say that if you start this book hoping for a gripping and driving plot right from the beginning, then you might be disappointed. Of course, towards the end there is a lot more plot, and I loved the ending of this book. It made me so excited to read the others. But in this one, for a lot of the book, be ready to be learning about the secondary world and just characters doing stuff. I realize my last point might make it sound like this book is kind of boring, which is not true. I felt like over the 1,000 pages, I was being slowly drawn into this story and this world. I was slowly becoming more invested in the characters and their journeys. I was slowly falling in love with this book. So to answer our questions from the start, yeah, this book is definitely worth your time. It really is as good as people say. I wouldn't be surprised as I read the other books in the series if this ends up being my favorite fantasy series of all time. Or maybe just one of my favorites. It's hard to topple number 1. Also, the writing in this book is really accessible. If you want sort of Tolkien level of world building, but with a story that's really easy to follow and the writing style that's much easier to understand, then this might be the one I would recommend. It's a slow burn, but the book takes you on just a beautiful journey through a brilliantly realized world full of great characters. The book is sometimes heart-pumping and at other times heartbreaking. It's full of suspenses and surprises. Basically, it's really damn good. I would highly, highly recommend that you check this out. If nothing else, the first 800 pages of build-up is honestly worth it for that last 200 pages of awesomeness. But we can talk about that more in the spoiler review if you want me to make one. So what are your thoughts on The Way of Kings? Let me know in the comments below. If you want to talk about anything else about this book, then let's do that down there as well. If you watched up to here, then just smash that subscribe button for even more weekly reviews. At the moment, I'm reading Dune by Frank Herbert. I'm about 100 pages in and it's a strange book. I'm going to keep going with it though, and that will probably be the review next week. Also, there'll be another video out soon about a couple books that are a bit more personal to me, so make sure you subscribe to catch those as well. In the meantime, like and share this video, check out my socials in the description, especially Twitter because I'm kinda obsessed with it at the moment. Till next week, see ya!